The World Affairs Council of Greater Reading is the leading educational organization promoting understanding and enlightenment on global issues. I am Mike, your host. Thank you so much for joining us once again today. We're really looking forward to a great luncheon presentation. And whether you're joining us as a member on Zoom or if you're watching along on Facebook on our live stream here today, this Thursday morning at noon on October 22nd, again, really looking forward to the presentation. It is going to be followed by a live Q&A, so go ahead and start entering your questions into chat, again, whether on Zoom or on Facebook. I do have everybody muted to avoid distraction during the presentation. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. To introduce our speaker today is a fellow board member, as well as professor joining us from Albright University, a professor of French and Spanish and director of the interim program at Martinique, Dr. Adam John.
All right, thank you, Mike. And I would like to take the time today to introduce Sasha to the rest of you and to really underscore the important work that he does and he has done. Sasha Lezhnev is Deputy Director of Policy at the Century Group, where he focuses on conflict, governance, corruption, and corporate accountability issues in Central Africa. He is also founding director of the Grassroots Reconciliation Group, an organization that works to reintegrate former child soldiers and refugees in northern Uganda. Sasha is a founding member of the Public-Private Alliance on Responsible Minerals Trade. He previously worked at Global Witness, the International Crisis Group, and the U.S. Institute of Peace on U.S. Policy and Conflict Resources, Extractive Industries Transparency, and Peace Processes in Africa. He was based in Uganda for 2.5 years as Senior Program Officer with the Northern Uganda Peace Initiative and advisor to the Chief Mediator of the peace process with the Lord's Resistance Army, or the LRA. He is the author of the book Crafting Peace, Strategies to Deal with Warlords in Collapsing States. He holds a master's degree in international relations from Cambridge University and a BS in foreign service from Georgetown University. Welcome, Sasha. We are so glad that you are here today.
Great, thank you so much, Adam, and to everyone at the World Affairs Council in Reading. I'm so sorry that I can't be there in person with you. I was really looking forward to the trip up to Reading today to meet all of you and folks at Albright. But alas, here we are. So hopefully that will enable more of you to join and also a good Q&A afterwards. So thank you for your kind introduction, Adam, and to Dave and Mike and Saul and the whole World Affairs Council team. I guess what I didn't put in my bio is how long I've been working on these countries, and particularly the DR Congo for over a decade. I've been going back and forth there after having lived in neighboring Uganda, and it is, and it was not my plan originally in my career to spend so long working on one country in particular, but the reality is it's such a fascinating place and sort of a melting pot of all the really interesting issues to do with international relations, with conflict resolution, with corruption, environmental issues, mining governance, the list goes on. And so, I'm so happy to share a little bit of what we've been trying to do on the Congo for the last decade, and have some discussion with you, because many people haven't heard of the country, or if they have, they don't know exactly what's happening there and how we are connected to it. So I hope today to talk a little bit, not just about some of the problems, but also some of the solutions and what life is like for people there, and how, in fact, there's a part of Congo actually in our everyday lives, which not a lot of people know about. So let me go ahead and share my my presentation here. I'll also show a little video. So just so you don't hear me talking all the time. Okay, right. Can you all see that? Okay, very good. All right, everyone's muted. So, but I saw the nods. Okay, very good. Well, yeah, just starting out a little bit. Where is Congo? So Congo is in the middle of Africa. the heart of Africa, as some might say. It is the size of almost all of Western Europe. In fact, we are connected to the Congo in more ways than we all imagine. In fact, I'm discovering new ways that we're connected to Congo almost every day. So just to start out with some recent examples, part of Congo is in basically all of our electronics products, unless you own sort of an Atari, anything recent, from a laptop to a phone to an electric vehicle or a hybrid car, mainly because of cobalt. So 50 to 60, and actually last year was closer to 70% of the world's cobalt, which is an essential ingredient in batteries. It basically is the thing that makes your battery not to explode. So you remember those famous Samsung phones that were exploding in everyone's airplanes and cars and whatever. I guess they didn't have enough cobalt. So there are a number of very large mines, and also a number of a very large number of small mines that produce cobalt in Congo. It's actually produced together with copper. So that is one example of one. Uranium from the Democratic Republic of Congo was used in the atomic bombs that were dropped in Japan to help end World War II. Was produced in the Shinkolobwe mine, which is in the former Katanga region in southeastern Congo. Copper in World War I went into basically every weapon system: armored tanks, jets, submarines, rifles, guns, etc. And a large supply of the world's copper at the time came from the Congo in mines controlled by the Belgians. And there's this famous quote that we found from a military journal saying it's almost impossible to kill a man in an up-to-date and scientific way without using copper. That was a World War I sort of quote. And of course, some of the world's first rubber plantations were in the Congo, but they were horrifically exploitative of human beings. And in fact, they were so exploitative that the Belgian King Leopold at the time, would order his officers to cut people's hands off if they tried to steal or run away, and have those hands sent back to Belgium. So this is an illustration by Sam Ilus of this period, a Congolese artist that we work with. And many people don't know that, in fact, over a third of the estimated slaves that came to America came from the Congo Basin. Congo Basin being Congo and a couple of the surrounding countries. The very first slaves were from Angola and Jamestown, but a very, very large number came from the Congo, in fact. And it was a recent radio episode where Mike Tyson traced his lineage back to Congo. I thought that was interesting. So just some basic facts about the country. I told you the size. It's over an estimated 100 million people. There's been conflicts occurring in Eastern Congo since the early 1990s. The International Rescue Committee estimated that some 3 to 7 million people have been killed in those conflicts. They've been driven, in large part by minerals from neighboring countries trying to exploit the Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda, as well as corrupt officials and army officers from the Congo itself. The country is currently has the world's second most acute food crisis, i.e., people who are food insecure. That's the step right above starvation and acute food shortages. There are over 5 million people currently displaced as a result of these conflicts. It's one of the lowest, the 12th lowest on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. And yet the country has some this is a very rough estimate, but has some $24 trillion worth of natural resources in the ground. So what is life like for people that live there? Well, according to statistics on a per capita basis, Congo is actually poorer today than it was in 1960, which is a little bit insane if you think about the incredible progress that countries that were roughly on Congo's per capita GDP at that time, including South Korea and other Asian countries. The World Bank said in 2018 that over 70% of the population lives on less than $1.90 a day. In other words, $700 a year. So just try to think about that, what that would mean. And I've been to Congo, over a dozen times, and the prices there are not something that you can easily live on. I mean, if you go to getting a pizza, for example, is like $12 in Congo. So there is actually a quite extensive system of corruption and violence. And we wrote a report a couple of years ago called The Criminal State, and documented basically patterns of corruption and violence that the state and outside facilitators, such as Belgium's King Leopold and modern day international facilitators like Dan Gertler from Israel and others, who have set these systems up in order to personally profit from Congo's natural resources and other things. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to get more into that system and how it works exactly, but just wanted to highlight it. And the conditions for average people are quite bad. They are better in some areas than others, but here you see the state of some of the roads that the current president is trying to improve, but the reality is very stark. The road networks are pretty horrific, and it takes weeks to cross the country by road instead of hours or a couple days. I then wanted to, I'm going to break from this just a second and tell you and show you a little video of what this means for Congolese people. Is it all bad? Is it they simply exploited all the time, or what their situation is? So let's just break for that for 1 second, and let's see how do I do this. Stop share. Okay. Right. Screen.
I think in my bad guy days. So as you can see, these are all my people.
Tonight, that's gonna be the big thing. People gonna rap big time here.
Quand les tremblements de terre étaient vraiment très atroces. Ce que j'avais pris après 3 jours, c'est ça.
Fidel Bafilemba, activists.
Fernando Aliko, artist.
Don Mikaba, conservationist.
Denise Siwatula, défenseur judiciaire.
Amani Matabaro, community builder and footballer.
Gone. Okay, can you all hear me again? Okay, very good. Well, thank you for watching. That's a video that we produced a couple of years ago. just to share with people, you know, what how Congolese people actually live, and you know, despite these this systemic exploitation by their own politicians and facilitated by outsiders. In fact, there's so many inspiring stories of how people live there and how they deal with things, and not just survive, but in fact overcome some of these horrible obstacles and en route to you know, living more successful lives. So just to give a known example, the person that I showed in the very first screen there, Denis Mukwege, won the Nobel Prize a year and a half ago. It was he co-won it with a Yazidi activist, and you know, for his very courageous work. He's a doctor. He saw the atrocities committed against women in particular in Eastern Congo, and decided to set up a clinic, which then became a hospital, and now as a whole a network of hospitals and recovery programs for women survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. And so he's performed many surgeries on women who have been raped and raped multiple times, but also now has set up these recovery programs, economic and psychosocial trauma recovery programs. I also wanted to share a story of someone that we have met and worked with, which was a very powerful one for me and some of my colleagues. This person's name is Janet. We met Janet when she was 13. And Janet was, when we met her, had been raped at the time by an army soldier. And in fact, it turns out that she became pregnant from the rape. And so she had the child, and she told us, you know, in contrast to when most women have children, she said, look, even though it's a child, when I see her, I actually felt like killing her, because this happened to me against my own will. She later went back to school. Janet was expelled then from school because they said that they're not going to help child mothers, that they're only there to help children. And later she found out that this soldier, we've been back multiple times, and my boss, John Prender, so later she told us that in fact this particular soldier, she was able to locate him, and he had joined one of the rebel groups. There are over 70 rebel groups in Eastern Congo, and there was a very large one supported by Rwanda at the time called the M23. Well, thankfully the M23 was defeated. There's a long story, and we played some helping role in that, and in helping cut off their finances. And the soldier was captured and finally put on trial for raping multiple people. And somehow this person was actually convicted of sexual violence. And so that was a sort of a miraculous incident. And magically also, Janet was not uncovered as a witness, which is very common in Eastern Congo. However, as is often the case in the very corrupt system, the judicial system there, he escaped prison just a few days after his conviction and was on the loose. Thankfully, again, not able to find Janet because she was anonymous. So when we went back, we found that Janet was now at university, and John and others had been supporting her through her schooling, and she really dreamed of being a lawyer and in fact a prosecutor. She told us that she dreamt of many things about the Congo, because if my dreams of becoming what I intend, that they will benefit my country. So she was studying law and to become a prosecutor. And so despite her hardships, despite being kicked out of school, she was able to join university and dreamt of a better future. And I just tell this story a little bit to say, well, is there anything we can do? Is there any hope for this pretty tragic situation for a country that is poorer than it was 60 years ago? So in fact, we believe there is some hope for Congo. And there are things we can do, and this is based on my own experiences and the experiences of the Century and the Enough Project, where Enough became the Century. And so I wanted to share a little bit of an example that inspired us. Our work for some years was the blood diamonds example, right? So if you recall, in the 1990s, Sierra Leone, a small country in West Africa, was engulfed in war that was driven in large part by diamonds. 1 in 5 people in the country became displaced or homeless as a result of the war. The UN estimated that between 25 and 125 million worth of diamonds were traded for guns every year. And then there was an activist campaign in '98 started by Global Witness and others to unbreak the link between, or to break rather the link between diamonds and conflict. And then 2 years later, the war ended, and something called the Kimberley process, which was a certification system, began, and really has helped to regulate the trade. It hasn't solved it, but it's helped to regulate it. And so, this inspired us to think, well, maybe there's something we can do about the Congo, which is much bigger, many more resources, et cetera, $24 trillion, but maybe there's something to be done. And so I want to tell you the story a little bit of our own story of the conflict minerals campaign that we helped start about 10 years ago or so. In 2010, so 10 years ago, the United Nations said that almost every mining deposit was controlled by a military group. And again, there are multiple different armed groups, now roughly 70. This is actually a photo that I took at a gold mine in Eastern Congo. And these minerals were going into electronics mainly, as well as jewelry. And we did a study and estimated that armed groups are making some $188 million a year from these minerals. Well, today, 10 years later, after quite a lot of work, which I'll talk about, some 3 out of 4 miners now work at mines that are no longer controlled by armed groups, at least for 3 of 4 minerals that have been driving conflict: tin, tantalum, and tungsten. The supply chain, just to give you an idea of how these minerals get into our product. So for gold, and specifically, which is one of the minerals, there are 15 sort of major mines and hundreds of smaller ones. Then the gold gets sent to local, local smugglers come to the mines, and then we'll send it on to regional smugglers in Uganda and Rwanda and Burundi and Tanzania. Almost all of the gold ends up in Dubai, UAE, in the Middle East. And then from there goes into banks, jewelry, even some electronics. And now you can trace a lot of this gold if you look at companies' reports to the Securities and Exchange Commission. So what could be done about this? Well, we decided, okay, we're gonna do sort of a 3-part strategic activism campaign, right? So let's try to get companies to trace where they're getting these minerals from. Let's try to get industry to set up an auditing system so that the choke point in the middle of the supply chain, which is the smelters or refiners of these minerals, can actually be held accountable for where they're sourcing from. And then third, similar to the Kimberley process, let's help set up a certification process for mines on the ground. So we went out and wrote to the 20 largest electronics companies. We focused on electronics at the beginning. We've since moved on to jewelry and automotive companies. And we just wrote them letters, and we said, hey, well, are you aware of this issue? And we talked to journalists, and they put them put these stories on the cover of newspapers. We were on the cover of the Boston Globe. We were on the cover of Congressional Quarterly with this BlackBerry that was dripping blood at the time. And then after engaging them, we decided to do a ranking of companies. So, you know, which companies were actually taking the steps to trace, audit, and certify, and which were not. And at the same time, we got a lot of interest from both parties in Congress to actually, you know, try to pass some legislation. And this legislation was actually introduced by Sam Brownback of Kansas, who later became the governor, as well as Dick Durbin of Illinois. It's probably the only piece of legislation those two worked on together. It's probably one of the most conservative senators and the most liberal senators working together. And then Russ Feingold, then of Wisconsin, joined them. And together they came up with a piece of legislation that got merged into something bigger that was moving, which is part of the Dodd-Frank bill, even though it was not, well, it was tangentially related to Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform bill. And then we worked together with some other NGOs with governments in the DRC as well as neighboring countries on a certification system to certify mines as whether they're being conflict-free or not. So we ended up having some really great success with some leading companies. So this is the then CEO of Intel, Brian Krzanich, who really took this issue up when he was a senior executive at the company and then later became CEO, and set a deadline for his company to say, okay, look, we want to set up an auditing system. So we'll work with industry on that, but I want our company specifically to source only from the audited conflict-free refiners. And here he is at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, getting up and giving the keynote presentation. And he talked mainly about this whole conflict-free initiative. And in fact, they achieved it. It was incredible. First, they only made conflict-free chips, and then eventually all of their products were conflict-free. Similarly, Apple was a real turnaround story. So when we ranked companies, Apple was kind of, you know, middle of the road. They were doing some things right, but a lot of things they were behind most of the other companies. And we protested. Actually, I was one of those involved, protesting the Apple store, the opening of the Apple store here in Washington, D.C. in Georgetown was the first one. You know, Georgetown, fancy area, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was a lot of fanfare about that. And so we, together with hundreds of students, protested the store. And then Steve Jobs found out about that. And also a journalist asked him a question. So what are you going to do about this whole conflict minerals issue? And so he called us directly. In fact, he called and no one was around. And so we called the number back and he said, you know, he said, oh, well, we saw a missed call from this. It says Apple. Yeah, this is Steve Jobs. What do you want with this conflict minerals thing? So that was very interesting. And we said, well, hold on, we'll get our team to talk to you. And so we flew out to Cupertino and met with him and the whole senior leadership, including Tim Cook. And they really turned around at the time. They were kind of middle of the road, and now they are one of the biggest leaders on this issue. And they also have become 100% conflict-free, sourcing from all these conflict-free refiners. So those are two companies. There are a few more that are sort of the leaders, but there's a lot of work still to do with other companies. The legislation, which was part of Senator Dodd and Representative Frank of their bill, ended up getting a lot of the other companies on board as well. They're not quite as far along as Apple and Intel and Google, but what it has really driven is supply chain transparency, such that 73, almost 3/4 of the world's smelters have now been audited by independent third-party audits that we helped to advise on. We didn't design them, but we advised on them to be conflict-free. So that's been very impressive. On the certification system, There was a certification process that has gone quite a ways. It's certainly not the end-all solution for this issue, but it basically, what happens is there are multi-stakeholder teams from UN and government and civil society that go and inspect mines, and then you see this on the French side, vert, jaune, rouge. The mines themselves either get a green certification, i.e. they're conflict-free and child miner-free. Yellow, they need improvement, or red, they are, they're still full of armed groups. And so I think it's 385 mines which have become conflict-free as a result of this. So the results in Congo, what does this mean for Congolese people? Well, as I said, 79% of the miners for tin, tantal, and tungsten mines now no longer work at conflict mines. There are almost 400 mines that have become conflict-free. The Congolese civil society activists and over 100 organizations wrote 2 years ago to the SEC defending this law and say, please do not overturn it or repeal it or suspend it, which was a threat at the time, to say that. And they, one of the things they've said repeatedly is that, in fact, this has helped lead to increased rule of law in this mining sector, which was extremely lawless and in shambles before. And there's one Congolese activist that I wanted to quote here who said that Dodd-Frank is worth its weight in gold because it's helped pull militias and commanders out of the mines and also prevented officials from taking the mining sector as their personal property, from continuing to do so. So it has not ended conflict, but it is helping move this sector in the right direction and break the link between conflict and minerals in Eastern Congo. Does this mean that the whole sector is cleaned up and that there are no more problems? No. Gold in particular is the outlier. And over 50% of gold miners in contracts to the 3Ts still work at mines controlled by armed groups. Some 10 to 20 tons of gold is smuggled out of the country every year. There are certain refiners in neighboring countries that get around the certification and auditing systems. And we did an investigation 2 years ago into this issue and continuing to work on it. It's called the Golden Laundromat. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to. We also need to see more conflict-free gold accepted. And there's a really interesting, I don't want to show video clip after video clip, but there's an interesting video on this called Journey of Gold that was actually premiered in Cannes in France a couple of years ago. It's a virtual reality film showing a conflict-free gold mine, what that is like for Congolese, and then the journey of that gold to the United States. It actually, and we ended up helping facilitate a process where it turned into jewelry in stores run by the company Signet. But part of the problem is that a lot of people and companies don't necessarily, or they're risk averse. They're worried about taking this gold, and so it's hard. It was hard for us to get that in, and it's hard for exporters continuing to try to export it out of Congo. Right. So this is my last slide, so that then we can move to questions. But just linking it back to us, are there things that you and I can do about the situation in the Congo? We're talking mostly today about the minerals trade, but there are other issues as well. But because that links so strongly with us and with our consumer purchases, there are a variety of things that actually we do that we can do to contribute and would have a direct impact. So number one is we have something called the Conflict-Free Campus Initiative, although really could be campus or campus conflict-free. A city conflict-free initiative or state conflict-free initiative. So cities, states, colleges, high schools, etc. They all buy electronics, right? But are they taking conflict minerals into account when doing so? Mostly not, right? And so that's why we came up with this initiative to help change procurement practices. So we've done this at a number of different colleges, cities, and states. I think Maryland, California, Massachusetts, Minnesota have all passed legislation on this. So their state procurement policies are different now. A number of different cities. I myself testified at a city council meeting in St. Petersburg, Florida. And then Pittsburgh also has a conflict-free initiative, et cetera. And many different campuses. I don't have count of the latest ones, but we're also trying to work on the World Bank to change their practices. You can also take more specific actions. So for example, that action you see down there on the conflict gold trade, urge the US and others to sanction gold smuggling companies, companies and traders that are smuggling conflict gold. It's a more specific action, like on our website. So you can click that and it'll direct you to I believe it's a letter and a social media post. And it's, at times there are opportune moments to write to companies on these issues. And then just frankly use your consumer buying power, right? So we have come up with company rankings on conflict minerals, on jewelry and tech companies. Have a look at those. See what you think. I'm not going to advertise for specific companies here. You can read them yourself. They're on our website, and educate yourself on these issues so that you can make more educated choices. And if you have questions, you can either ask us or ask the companies directly. What are you guys doing about this issue? So that's all for me for right now, and looking forward to talking more and answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
All right. Good presentation. I appreciate the everything that you shared. We will take some questions here. I've got a couple already coming in through the chat, through Facebook. So where did your interest personally come from? You elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. So I, going back a little bit, I lived and worked in Uganda on the LRA, Joseph Kony, if you remember Kony 2012, that was a big movement. And I interviewed as part of that. I was a researcher there. I was a researcher on conflict resolution. And as part of that, I was interviewing hundreds of people who had survived Kony's LRA, who were mainly abducted as former child soldiers. And once you meet one or two or even three or more than that, it really, you can't forget it. You can't get it out of your mind. And so, I just had to do something to try to prevent this from happening. This was not World War II. You're not meeting people who, survived something 50, 60, 70 years ago. You're meeting people who had just escaped from the rebels either a few weeks or months ago. So this is happening just now. And so I've basically been trying to do a variety of things to help people like that since then. I founded this organization when I left or when I was leaving Uganda to continue some direct programs for former child soldiers in northern Uganda. But look, I have a degree in international relations. And so, what could I do from a policy standpoint to change the systems that enable that exploitation to continue, not just in Uganda, but in other places as well. And the Democratic Republic of Congo has, been the world's worst war zone for human beings since World War II. And so that has been seems to be a very good place to try. We're not successful in everything, but we continue to try to do new things and different things. So we've started a whole investigative line of work to really look at the bad guys who are profiting from that. So that's partially where that Golden Laundromat comes from. But yeah, that's kind of the motivation. And I love to go back and meet more of these people to help keep myself and ourselves motivated. In fact, there's a donor that I travel with from time to time, and he goes back periodically to like he says to give himself a punch in the gut basically just a reality check of what's actually happening out in the world. And I feel that too. You know, you sometimes forget, but especially with technology nowadays, it's easier not to forget. We have videos, we have you know, Facebook. We can WhatsApp message or video with people to remember what's really happening.
Yeah, and it sounds like you've had some successes with the organization, but great. I mean, it's probably an issue that I had very little awareness of before, so it's important. It's good to hear this. I'm glad you're out doing it. You referenced like the conflict diamonds, and I think everybody's kind of familiar with that, but that this is equally as dire and dangerous a situation. As it's good that you're out here building this awareness, and I appreciate you sharing with us today. We do have some questions coming in from members and through Facebook. Adam John asked, towards the end of your presentation, I saw a reference to the artisanal mining sector. Can you just explain what artisanal mining is?
Sure. I actually hate that term, but it's a pretty widely used term, so I will I will stick with it. Artisanal and small scale mining, or ASM as it's called. It's basically you know, in mining you have sort of well, two main ways of mining, and there's a way in the middle too. You have the industrial large scale mines, which, you know, I think we saw a picture of with the sort of the spiral, you know, carving out of the mountain, using heavy machinery and not that many people, or large tunnels dug by heavy machines. Or you have mines that are basically being explored by people using shovels and pickaxes, and, you know, sometimes they dig tunnels that are like highly illegally deep. Sometimes it's more open pit. A lot of times companies who are interested in areas will actually wait for artisanal miners to go and explore an area to actually see that. I mean, they can save money this way, to see if there are deep veins of, you know, tin or gold or diamonds. And then all of a sudden when these miners come back with it, you know, then all of a sudden they'll buy up the mine. You know, there are, I believe, an estimated 40 million artisanal miners for all minerals in the world. 41, I think, is the latest estimate, including many women, which was relatively ignored until recently. So there's a whole movement to boost the livelihoods of artisanal women miners. But it's a huge industry in Congo. It's also a hugely exploited industry in Congo. Most of the miners in Congo are illegal technically, because of the systems that have been set up by these corrupt officials. So, you know, they'll charge miners for like a registration card, but then they won't actually register them with the national authorities, and so they'll basically extort these miners year after year for these cards. They have to pay bribes at multiple different places. They're up to 40% children, in particularly in copper and cobalt, but also in gold and diamonds. Pretty much every mineral, really. Not up to 40%, but at all mines certainly. But particularly where they're, you know, smaller shafts, or the minerals are a little smaller. So, for example, gold and diamonds. There's a lot of that. So that's a bit on that.
And you talked about a lot of gold, copper, rubber, timber, tungsten, cobalt. Peter Sheridan on Facebook asked about or comments on coltan, that it's very dangerous. There have been reports of deaths, yet I don't see much info outside the internet. So maybe the question is, why doesn't that get more coverage?
Right. So coltan is actually like a Congo-specific nickname for columbite tantalite, which turns into tantalum. So if you look at tantalum, or what we would call the 3 T's, tantalum, tin, and tungsten, there's a lot more on that. So yes, for years and years, tantalum or coltan was a very significant conflict mineral. It is very much less so today, thanks to the legislation, thanks to these company systems, thanks to the certification system. etc. Intel is actually one of the world's biggest users of tantalum. Tantalum mainly goes into semiconductors, or what we would call chips. And so being one of the biggest companies, or I believe probably the biggest chip maker, they are a huge consumer of tantalum. Tantalum also goes in a couple of other, like there's some defense functions. There's something called a tantalum target. There's a few other things, but mainly it goes into that. And the thing about the 3Ts, all three of them, is that they're larger minerals, and so they're harder to hide. And so therefore that makes them easier to control the trade of. They also don't go into tons and tons of hands and companies worldwide. So gold is much more difficult to control because, everyone on this call would, if I had a little bit of gold, would take it. If I had, like a sack of tantalum, you'd probably look at me like, excuse me, thanks, but I didn't want coal for Christmas. And so, therefore industry can have some impact, and that's part of the reason but there's still, there's still a lot of exploitation with regard to tantalum, and there's still a lot of tantalum being smuggled, in particular to Rwanda and other places, although that is decreasing.
I don't see too many other questions yet specifically on the mining, but we're getting some questions about the governments and relationships. Both Adam, John, and Randy Newnham ask about Rwanda. So Adam says, can you talk about the complex relationship between Rwanda and the DRC since the 1990s? And then Randy had asked about the role between Rwanda and in East Congo now, and can they be made to stop intervening there?
Great. Well, how many hours do you have? So it is a very complicated relationship. I will say a lot of it has been exploitative for several years. But Rwanda essentially has some very strong interests in Eastern Congo. Economic interests are very significant. For years and years, Rwanda has been trading or buying, or in some cases smuggling minerals from Congo. Rwanda invaded Congo a couple of different times, most recently with this M23 as its proxy force, and the Rwandan army and other Rwandan-backed armed groups. So, for example, the CNDP and others were heavily exploiting minerals. Today, there are allegedly armed groups that are backed by Rwanda who are exploiting gold and some other minerals. So there is that exploitative aspect. Rwanda is also trying to set up processing plants and is increasing its certification program. So there are a number of mines that are certified in Rwanda, and so there's a growing domestic mining sector, which is very positive in terms of developing its own mineral industry, so it's not reliant on Congo. Rwanda also has political interests in Congo. There are Rwanda phone speakers of Kinyarwanda who live in Congo. People have settled from Rwanda into Congo, many of whom are Congolese citizens. And so there is that influence as well. I think part of the key really is to help transform some of the economic and political interests from exploitative to more normal neighborly business. The U.S. has a lot of economic interests in Canada and Mexico, but we don't, go to war over it. We have trade agreements, et cetera, et cetera. So, similarly to Rwanda and Congo, there are some initiatives. So, for example, the UN has a special envoy for the whole region, and they're trying to set up more normal economic relations. The treaty that ended, or the agreement that ended the M23 conflict, has a whole section on regional economic responsible trade, etc. So that's an important area. But there also needs to be accountability. And so there was a report that the UN did 10 years ago called the Mapping Report, And that's gotten a lot of attention recently because Denis Mukwege, the Nobel Prize winner that I mentioned, highlighted it, as well as many other Congolese, saying, hey, wait a minute, there was a mapping report that documented atrocities that had occurred in the 1990s, including by Rwandans, but not only. And these people have not been held accountable for that. So it's very important that, in fact, there is accountability and judicial mechanisms that are set up to deal with those crimes, so that the victims and survivors can have some accountability for them.
So if we stick with the government aspect, right? We've had very often in these luncheon presentations, China comes up. And Saul Lausch, who we'll hear from with the announcements towards the end of the presentation here, asks, the Chinese are everywhere, including Africa. Do the Chinese have a presence in the Congo?
Chinese have a very important presence in the Congo. It's largely not in the mineral sector that we talked about today. They were in the gold sector for a bit. Then they were exposed by a very good Global Witness report called River of Gold, which I'd encourage you to read. But the Chinese are very big partners. They established a $6 billion mines for infrastructure partnership with the government. I'm trying to remember what year it was, but several years ago. And they have not delivered all of their money. And a lot of their money has gone missing. And in fact, the agreements, the sub-agreements, the main agreement, the framework agreement was public, but a lot of the follow-ups have not been published. And so a lot of people are wondering, where is the money going? Some big Chinese companies, China Non-Ferrous Metals, there's a couple of other ones, China Molybdenum, control large copper and cobalt mines. In fact, a Chinese company took over a mine from Freeport-McMoRan a couple of years ago. They sold it off. And so a lot of the minerals, a lot of the mining for copper and cobalt is controlled by the Chinese. Not solely, though. There are other Western companies as well. But I would say one of the most important roles for China here is the processing of these minerals, right? So a lot of those smelters and refiners that we talked about, 73% have passed the audits, are located in China. Not all, but tungsten, for example, is very heavily refined in China. Tin, some gold. The Shanghai Gold Exchange is a big international gold bullion trading center, are located there. But the beauty of the whole interconnectedness of the minerals trade is that, in fact, if Western companies, Apple, Intel, and others are buying these minerals, they're buying them largely, not only, but a significant measure from Chinese smelters. And so there exists a very significant form of leverage. If Apple is required or it chooses to source only from audited smelters and will cut out smelters from its supply chain who are not audited, then all of a sudden these Chinese smelters have to get audited, or they'll be out of supply chains. And so there's a very large number. I don't have the exact number from today, but if you look on the Responsible Minerals Initiative website, you'll find them of Chinese smelters and refiners who've actually undergone the same third-party independent audits that a smelter in South Carolina or Nevada would. And that's a real revolution from my standpoint, because we're able, through our own market regulations here in the United States, we're able to exert better corporate accountability on companies in China. So that is interesting. And then I would say in general, as China develops, we are seeing some improvements on some of their business practices. Certainly not 100%, but there is something there.
Yeah, so Randy has another question. We heard from him earlier on the topic of Rwanda, and it's a question that I had too in my notes. So he asked, what's the nature of Congo's government now? Is there less corruption before? Is there hope for reform there? And I think, so listening to your presentation, it sounded like there were almost two parts of it. You led early by saying extreme poverty has been getting worse since the 1960s. Then you shared the video that showed a lot of optimism. You talked about a couple successes that you had. 79% of miners in 385 mines are conflict free. So I don't want to say like which is it, but like how is that trickling down to the actual miners themselves, the citizens and residents of the area?
Yeah, great question. Well, that's sort of a series of questions, so I'll try to do my best to answer them. There is some incremental progress and some initial signs for hope. Let's put it that way. So I didn't touch upon this in a lot of detail, but there was a very important election in Congo almost 2 years ago, so December of 2018. And the current president, or the president at the time, President Kabila, was basically trying to stay in power. And you know, he has presided over this big system as during the time of his own presidency, which is roughly 15 years. He's the son of the former president who was assassinated, Laurent Kabila. And he was really attempting to change the constitution to stay in power. Activists and international pressure prevented that from happening. And so then his second option was, okay, well, I'm going to handpick a successor and back him with all of my family and money and all of that. And the election finally happened, although it was 2 years delayed. I mean, that's sort of insane in and of itself, but it eventually happened. And it was abundantly clear that this guy lost, that his handpicked successor not just lost, but lost very, very badly. His name was Emmanuel Ramazani Shadari. And so let's hope this doesn't happen in our own election, but the election happened, and then there were no results that were released, right? And so they just waited and waited and waited and waited. And finally, somebody leaked the results, and it was 60% supposedly went to the opposition, and I think 19% to the person who ended up becoming president, and then even less to the handpicked successor, and then some smaller parties got even less than that. So so President Kabila was basically forced to go with a different option, and the option that they chose was to make a deal with the person who got roughly 20%, called Felix Tshisekedi, who was the son of a major Congolese activist for many years, Etienne Tshisekedi. And so to hand over power to him, even though he wasn't part of the same party or even the same coalition, they hand over power to this guy who was a much weaker president, to be fair, but from an opposition party, the UDPS, as it's called, the Union for Democratic. Well, anyways, it's a French acronym. So, and this president, Tshisekedi, has made some progress on certain areas, right? So he released a lot of political prisoners. He's increased space for civil society and for demonstrations, and there's now like a much bigger anti-corruption movement in the Congo than there was before. Other politicians who were exiled from the country by Kabila have now returned. And he's prevented some of the most corrupt officials from becoming minister or the prime minister or staying on. Let's put it that way. He's also somehow orchestrated such that his own what do you call it, chief of staff was convicted for corruption, which is kind of revolutionary in Congo if you think about that. This is one of his biggest political allies. So there are some signs of hope. We are working now on some new reports relating to the elections, and there's a big movement in Congo for electoral reform. Let's see if it actually happens. But so there's some reforms afoot. Are they going to stick? I don't know. Is Kabila out of the picture? Certainly not. He is very influential, in his party and his family and his political coalition called the National Front for Congo, or Common Front for Congo, the FCC, is very powerful and controls a lot of institutions. But as Tshisekedi has been in power, he's made inroads into the judiciary. In fact, they just swore in some constitutional court justices, which were very much allied with him and not with the former president. Just it was yesterday, and they are trying to make reforms on the state-owned companies, etc. So there are some signs. He's also promised universal primary education. He needs more donor money to do that. And so there's a lot of donor packages that are being negotiated now to see if they can make some of those things happen and try to build infrastructure. He was in Eastern Congo 2 weeks ago and, saw some of the horrible roads like we saw in the picture today. So, has made some promises on those things. So let's see if those happen, and let's see if Kabila tries to make a comeback for power. That I would anticipate they will try to make a comeback in one way or another.
Yeah, probably just a few questions left as we start to wind down a little bit here. Are you still okay for time?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. So I guess just to follow up a little bit on what you just said, how is that trickling down into the actual citizens? It sounds like there are some reforms coming. There are good positive signs. Have you seen a tangible impact on quality of life, poverty and incomes, freedoms of the people, impact of crime? Like, what do you see there?
Not huge impact yet. You have to keep in mind it's first of all, we're all in COVID, and the COVID economic shutdowns have been very destructive for Congolese people who are, many of whom live on the edge of survival. Really, food prices went up. The Congolese franc, their currency is in inflation at the moment. Their foreign reserves are down, so that's one thing. Number two is it's an entire superstructure, I will say, of corruption from bottom to top, right? And so, we talked about some of the big figures, but, there was a study done a couple of years ago, which said that the average informal taxes that Congolese pay is over 50% in terms of all the bribes and so forth. And so that is keeping minor officials afloat, right? And I mean, it really is a whole system. Like for traffic cops, for example, they're deployed at certain hours to collect for their bosses. And then at other hours, they're able to sort of just collect for themselves, bribes and so forth. And so, like, depending on when you enter the traffic circle, you're like, oh, well, now my money's going to go to this person. Now my money's going to go to that person. To dismantle that entire system requires much more transformative change than a deal between one corrupt official and, somebody who he negotiated with. It was certainly, there was actually a Democratic winner of the last election who probably would have engendered much more radical reforms, who was, who did not gain power. His name is Martin Fayulu, and who was talking about some of those more radical reforms. So I mean, the tangible effects that I think we're seeing are the fact that civil society is, and people are able to get out, by and large, not 100%, to really raise their voice on these issues, particularly on corruption, which is really the heart of of all the other issues like infrastructure, health, education. It all roots back to corruption. And finally, people are able to talk about it. The president talks about it all the time. They're trying some things. So that, I would say, but it's still hidden. I mean, in terms of being able to really have tangible impacts. And of course, this universal primary education hasn't taken off yet, but it's still a big part of the president's agenda.
It sounds like you're doing a good job of going after the money, which is where the impact is going to show up. So that's so speaking of money, I guess I had a question as you were talking about the funding for these kinds of activities. Obviously, you're putting time into it. You talked about some of the NGO networks that are putting money behind this. What's fueling financially this movement?
Oh, right. I mean, from the Congolese standpoint, people have been trying to do this for years. That doesn't really require funding. I mean, they have been, demonstrating and doing their own initiatives and writing papers and so forth. There is some foundation and donor money helping our collective efforts. Our co-founder is George Clooney, so through him we're able to raise some money. If he appears somewhere, people like that, and sit at a table with him, they'll write a check, etc. And there are aid projects for NGOs and groups on the ground. Aid is harder to come by nowadays for a variety of reasons, but partially COVID related. So it's a challenging environment. But for dedicated, brave Congolese activists, they are going to keep going regardless. And we're seeing this year after year, and in fact, increasing. I don't know exactly what the aid budgets look like for next year yet, but certainly I would say we're seeing increases in this anti-corruption activity, at least for now. I think the bigger question more is, as we look to the next election in Congo, which is 2023, is the government going to start restricting citizens' access to social media or the internet or phones and that kind of thing? The last government shut down those things on a number of occasions when they were worried about people gathering or larger demonstrations or online campaigns or that kind of thing.
So I think I've just got two questions here. They'll be a little bit easier, so we'll let you off the hook a little bit. Again, I appreciate you coming today, Sasha, representing the Century, your organization. Great conversation today. And then so just these last couple questions, then we'll turn the meeting over to Saul. Earlier in the presentation, Chris had asked, and I thought I'd kind of save it till the end. You had mentioned River of Gold. What are some books or readings you recommend for someone to become better informed as to the significant history and events of the Congo over the post-World War II period, from Chris Woolert?
Great. Well, I will plug our own report as one, which is a good overview. I would say it's not a good story per se, but it's a really good overview in terms of like, how does this system work? How can I make sense of Congo over the last, it's really 150 years, or 130, I think we go back, and the patterns that come out, and we've got really a nice summary, but also like bullet points for every chapter. So it's called A Criminal State. So if you look up Criminal State Congo, you'll find it. That's a good one. My boss and an activist called Fidel Bafilemba wrote a book called Congo Stories, which does tell a lot of really good stories. And in fact, the story that I told today is in that book and in a lot more detail, and together with a number of other quite inspiring stories, and the photographs in the book were taken by Ryan Gosling. So, and if you go to the website Congo Stories, there's some cool videos as well. There's a good movie. Well, I recommend two movies maybe. One is called Merci Congo. So I'm actually in this movie, haha, not in a starring role, but I'm in it. So it's about a number of different things. It's about the minerals trade. It traces, goes to mines in Congo. It also, features more extensively the story of Intel and that CEO that I mentioned, but also more in depth into, some inspiring stories in Congo. So that's a good one. And Rwanda, it goes into Rwanda a bit. So the Merci Congo is actually, like, thank you Congo, is actually a hill in Rwanda's capital, Kigali. So if you think about that, like, thanks to Congo, we built this hill, and it's like where the embassies were, etc. So it's a very nice place in the city. And then another book. There's another one called Dancing in the Glory of Monsters. Dancing in the Glory of Monsters by Jason Stearns. He's a pretty good storyteller, probably better than me. And that's a good read too. It's a little dense, but a lot of people like it. So and I think it's good. And I'll plug one more. How about that? So there's a guy called a journalist with the Financial Times called Tom Burgess, Burgis. And he has a book now called Kleptopia, but doesn't focus a lot on Congo. But his book previous to that, whose name is escaping me right at the moment, is a quite good one. Maybe I'll send it to you, Dave, and then or Mike, and then or Dave and Mike, and then you can send that around. So
yeah, sounds good. Adam mentioned in the chat that the book Congo Stories was what inspired him to reach out to you and also to John Pendergrast in doing this presentation. So last question, then we'll turn the meeting over to Saul here. What has been, you didn't take the call, it sounded like, from the way you told the story from Steve Jobs, but maybe that could have been on the list. But what's been the most surprising or memorable positive experience that you've had in your time at the Century?
Wow, there's a lot of them. I would say it was, by the way, the book, I found it, it's called The Looting Machine. And it's not all about Congo, but it's got, I think, 1 or 2 chapters on, actually, it's 1 chapter, but with 2 sort of different parts of the chapter on Congo, which is really good. Tom Burgess, Looting Machine. Right. I would say that my most memorable experience was on a trip with that donor that I talked about, who wanted to get the gut punches, right? And we sat with a woman who had just the most gut-wrenching story you can imagine. She had been raped multiple times by different armed groups. Several of her children had been raped. Her husband was killed in front of her. It was just one horrific incident after another. Then we asked her, like, okay, well, looking forward, what do you want? What do you want to do? What do you think should be done? And she was all talking about accountability. Like, we need to hold these people accountable. Like, and I'm collaborating with the International Criminal Court to try to convict these people and be a witness. So despite her own personal horrific experiences, that she was able to pick up the pieces and really try to take action obviously at great risk to herself and her family. That to me personally was just so inspiring to see that, because most people would just say, God, I just want to forget about this. And, and we were with this, fairly wealthy American, like, get me a visa, like, let's get out of here. I want to, and she's like, I want to help my country. I don't want this to happen later to other Congolese people. Let's do something about it. That was very inspiring.
Yeah, very inspiring. Thanks again so much for joining us today. Honored to have been able to spend a little time with you this afternoon. And I'm going to turn the meeting over to our president, Dr. Saul Lausch, for our closing comments and announcements.
Yeah, well, thank you also, Sasha. Very, very interesting for us. Really appreciate that you're going to be with us virtually here in the rest of the day at Albright College in different ways. So that's just great. And a reminder, please send us your contact information. We want to give you a little gift that expresses our local Pennsylvania German culture. So we'll send that to you.
Thank you so much, Saul.
And perhaps for your information, as much as anybody else who's on our call here yet, but coming up, you may be interested, Tuesday, November 10, we have Robert Daly speaking on the topic of China. He's the director of the Kissinger Institute on China. And Thursday, November 19, we think a very interesting presentation from Michael Baranowski. He's speaking on the European perspective of NATO. He's speaking to us out of Helsinki, rather the Warsaw office, and we think that'll be very, very interesting. Something that Dave Bean has set up as a counterpoint of part 2 from what we've talked about with NATO, and looking forward to it. So if you're interested, you can join us anytime you may want. December 9, we're going to have a presentation on climate change, which we've done before, always topical. And then December 16, actually departing some of our usual ways a little bit, we have James Olson speaking on My Friend the Spy. the notorious case of FBI Special Agent Robert Hansen, who basically sold us out to the Soviets and their successors, and is now spending his rest of his life in prison without parole. But he was working in the United States, close friend of our speaker. So that's the kind of thing we try to do to bring variety. You've certainly helped us with that today, and we really, really appreciate it. We don't often have presentations that take us into the continent of Africa, and we thank you for that, Sasha.
Well, thanks so much, Saul, and maybe I'll attend your talk on Hansen. That's that's pretty interesting. He not only collaborated with the Soviets, but as a result of that collaboration, actually, I'm a Russian American. One of my friend's parents was killed because of that. So I think that'll be a very interesting presentation.
Please join us. Okay, thank you, everyone.